So in this lesson, we find ourselves in Turkey. Turkey is a really interesting country for a number of different reasons. Here's the first. Imagine a country that straddles 3 different continents, and that is Turkey. You can be in Istanbul, and on one side of a body of water, you find yourself in Asia, and on the other side, you find yourself in Europe, and travel a little bit to the south in Turkey, and now you're in Africa. So 3 separate continents, a lot of different influence. Another thing that makes Turkey interesting is that historically, a lot of the camel caravans, the trading caravans that were bringing goods from the Far East, made their way to what was Constantinople and is now Istanbul. That was the terminus of the camel caravans. There was a lot of trade and a lot of commerce and a lot of interchange of ideas. The last thing I'll say about Turkey before we dig into this, and this is maybe the most significant, is that way back when, Turkey was not a unified nation, but instead a series of nomadic tribes that were often working at cross purposes to one another. Many years ago, probably about 2,000 years ago, they decided that they would put their differences aside and become a confederation. And that confederation was the genesis of the Ottoman Empire, one of the most powerful empires at the time. They were centered in Constantinople, or modern-day Istanbul, and they had a huge palace there, and in that palace they organized the cooking, they organized the cuisine in a very particular way. They didn't just have cooks in the kitchen, they had the best cooks, and they were expected to specialize. So if you had someone who knew how to cook fish very well, that's all they did. They weren't making pastries, they weren't making soup, they weren't even roasting meat. All they did was roast fish. And then the people that roasted meat well, that's what they did. The pastry makers got on with making pastries, the bread bakers baking bread. Many people credit French cuisine with organizing kitchens in that way into stations. But long before the French got the idea, it was going on in the palace kitchens of Istanbul. So most meals in Turkey were or will begin with small dishes, meze, and we'll talk in other lessons about the small dish tradition known as meze, but it's a great expression of hospitality. And then likely you might move on to a soup course, and I'm going to make a simple soup course for you right here. Simple in ingredients, but the technique is important, so I would have you pay attention. I have some chicken broth right here, and in it I cooked some rice. So the rice is already cooked. And we're going to bind or enrich this soup with yogurt, but I can guarantee you, if you put yogurt into a hot soup, it would break into a curdy mess. So this technique that we're going to use is kind of important. First thing we're going to do is take some cornstarch, about a tablespoon of cornstarch, and I'm going to create a slurry in some cool water. I want to dissolve the cornstarch so that there are no lumps. And then here I have some drained yogurt. So here's yogurt. I have it in a little bit of a piece of cheesecloth, and it's just losing little by little the excess whey. We're going to take the yogurt and add that right into our slurry of cornstarch and water. Next, we're going to add an egg. A whole egg, and egg could be problematic too, because if it gets too hot, it will break or it will scramble. That's probably the right word. So let's make sure that everything is smooth. I want to mix that cornstarch with all the other ingredients. And then finally, I'm going to add a little bit of milk to this. I want to make sure that this is nicely seasoned, so we'll put some salt in there. We're going to garnish this with dried mint, and so I have my dried mint here, and likely a little drizzle of olive oil. Now, what we need to do, and I'll move this over here so it's easier for you to see. If I were to take this and put it in there, likely the eggs would cook very quickly. So we're going to temper this mixture with hot liquid. And what I want to do is just stir in the hot liquid a little bit at a time and incrementally raise the temperature of this yogurt until it is warm or even as hot as what's in this pot. So this tempering process is very, very important. Once you get this warm or even hot, we can add it back to the soup, stir them both together, and bring it back to the heat. And slowly, I want to bring this up to a boil. It'll take about 5-10 minutes to do. Stir it so that everything stays homogeneous. The starch will bind everything together, and the starch is not completely cooked, I think, until about 185 degrees. So a boil tells us that it's completely cooked. So you see around the edge, it's just coming up to a simmer. And we don't want it to cook too aggressively, so I want it to heat evenly, and that's why I'm stirring it. And we are there. So once it comes up to that boil, don't boil it endlessly. There's no need. The rice will also just start to break down if you're not careful. Before we plate this, let's make sure we're happy with the flavor. It needs a little bit of salt, but it's got a nice tang from the yogurt. All right, remember we've got rice in this soup, so dig deep and make sure that each portion gets a little bit of rice. This is a nice light soup, and in a climate that likely is hot a good deal of the year, it's refreshing to have a soup that's as light as this. Next, I'm going to drizzle on just a little bit of olive oil. And then finally, sprinkle on dried mint and some black pepper. And that's our hot yogurt soup, which is how a lot of Turkish meals begin. If not this soup, then another. So next I'd like to move on to a vegetable course in our Turkish meal. I'm going to make some rice, and we're going to use that rice, that flavorful rice, to stuff vegetables. This is a pretty common practice. You'll see it not just in Turkey, but Greece as well. And oftentimes early in the day, a restaurant will stuff vegetables and roast them in the oven until they're very tender, and then serve them just at room temperature. So I have a pan on the heat that's hot, and we are going to saute some onions in olive oil. And once those onions turn translucent, then we can move on. Now, I have some rice here, and this rice has been soaked in water until it goes from translucent to chalky white, the way you see it here. This will help the rice cook more evenly and help the rice not break up as it cooks. So we'll get a better product by doing that. This is a measured amount of water, probably about 1.5 times as much water as there is rice for this type of rice. We're also going to flavor this rice, and I have a couple of different seasonings here. Black pepper, and then I have cinnamon, and I have allspice. So black pepper, cinnamon, and allspice. We're going to season this rice with salt, and it might surprise you to see a little bit of sugar making its way into the rice as well. Inasmuch as we're going to stuff vegetables, which are sweet in their own right, with this rice, it makes sense that we might season with a little bit of sugar. So I'm going to move ahead here. I'm going to take and add some cinnamon to these onions. I'm going to add allspice. I'm going to put in just a little bit of sugar and some black pepper. Already I can smell the sweet spices filling the room with their aroma. I'm going to add some salt, and we'll put the rice and its water right into the pan. And we'll bring this up to a boil. I'm also going to add some raisins that have been plumped in water, and those can cook right along with the rice and lend their sweetness to the rice. You're starting to get the sense, I'm hoping, that this is a full flavored rice, and it needs to be. The reason for that is that the flavor of this rice needs to also be the flavor that carries the day with the vegetables that will be stuffed with this rice. This needs to come up to a boil. We put a lid on it, we turn the heat down and simmer it until the water's absorbed and the rice is tender. At that point, so that it doesn't overcook, I would suggest that you dump it out onto a shallow pan and let it cool. And if you look, I have some rice here already. We're going to introduce some toasted pine nuts. And the pine nuts I add after the rice is cooked so they stay a little bit crisper. And we're going to add a bunch of herbs. And here is dill and mint both. And what I want to do is gather these herbs up and we'll chop them and add them to our rice. Okay. So a lot of fresh herbs. As I said, this is a full flavored rice to flavor all the vegetables that we will stuff with this rice. All right, there's our rice stuffing. Now, I have some vegetables here, and you can see what I've got. Here is the shell of an onion, and the insides may have been the onion that I put into the rice, but here I left the outside raw and hollowed it out so that we could stuff that. I've got some peppers. Here, green pepper, and I would just cut the ribs out. And they'll make a nice little receptacle. Same with red pepper. Here's an eggplant that I'm going to cut in half, and we will fashion a little boat out of it. I'm going to just cut the flesh and scoop it out. And we'll do the same thing here. Oftentimes what people will do in Turkey, cooks, is they will take all of this vegetable matter that comes out of the inside of the vegetables and they'll saute that separately, season it, and then they'll add it just to the rice so it can make its way into the vegetables. All right. Here is a tomato, and I'm going to go in and just loosen the insides and scoop those out. Let me just... So now we have one tomato, and I'll do the same with another. We'll open this up, loosen the insides. The insides of these tomatoes could make their way into stocks and soups, or if you were going to braise a piece of meat, you might take what I call tomato guts, but this is a tomato product like crushed tomatoes, and you could add that to your braise. All right, let me add eggplant here. We'll cozy these up with one another. I'm going to add another piece of eggplant. And I want to take this rice stuffing and we're going to mound it into the various and sundry vegetables. And you can see now why having a lot of flavor is a good idea. These vegetables now need to be seasoned with a little bit of salt and pepper. This is for the vegetables now. We know the filling is seasoned. And I like to put some sort of liquid in the bottom of the pan before I pop it in the oven at about 375 degrees for a half an hour, 35 minutes, something like that. Sometimes I'll use chicken stock. when I'm baking vegetables like this. Other times I'll use vegetable stock. But we have here some yogurt that's been draining, and below is some of the whey from that yogurt. And it has a great flavor. It's a little bit sharp. There's some sweetness to it as well. And by the time the flavor of the onion, the eggplant, the tomato, the pepper mingle with these juices, I can guarantee you it'll make a really delicious sauce. So we'll put some whey in the bottom here. I'm going to drizzle a little bit of olive oil over the top. And we'll pop these into the oven. If you like the idea of putting the lids on these tomatoes, you can certainly do it. We'll pop these in the oven at about 375 degrees for 35 minutes. And so these vegetables are tender now. There's a little bit of sauce in the bottom. This would be a nice addition to our meal. If we started with meze and moved on to a soup, you might expect next a vegetable course. And these vegetables are perfect at room temperature. So I'd like to make a meat dish for you now. This is what would typically be seen towards the end of a Turkish meal. We'd start with meze, move on to soup, vegetables, fish, and then meat might come later along with starches. I've got some lamb shanks right here, and I've been browning them for a while. A lamb shank is a heavily exercised muscle from right here on the lamb. The closer that the meat gets to the ground, the more exercise it sees. And that exercise creates a very tough piece of meat, but at the same time, very flavorful. Your challenge as a chef is to make sure that it gets tender, and you do that by cooking it long and slow in a moist environment. So these are nicely browned here right now. And if you notice, the bones have been cut by the butcher. That's so that the marrow inside the bone can make its way into our braise. It's delicious. It lends a lot of richness and flavor to the dish. Anyhow, I'm going to add some onions, and we'll cook those onions in exactly the same fat. I'm going to turn the heat up just a little bit, and we will brown those onions to develop another layer of flavor that's going to make its way into this dish. Now, so I'm going to move this forward a little bit faster, but my suggestion to you is let the onions take on kind of a deep golden color, and then we're going to add a little bit of garlic to the pan as well. And the garlic, I would be careful about browning. It will always taste a little bit bitter if it starts to over brown, so just be careful with that. And when this preparation is to the point where you want to move on, I'm going to introduce two things. I'm going to introduce some stock, and lamb as a lighter meat could use chicken stock, a lamb stock if you had one, or some people would even go as far as to put veal or beef stock in there. I'm using chicken stock today here. And then we're also going to add kind of a spicy tomato sauce. So the question, and I think it's a good one, how much sauce or how much liquid do you put in? Now, there's a rule of thumb in kitchens everywhere that you add liquid so that it comes halfway up the side of what it is that you'll be braising. That's a good enough answer, but imagine that I had a pan that was 4 times this size. For me to add that much liquid would probably take 4 times as much liquid, and that would be inappropriate. In effect, what would happen is my sauce would be watery and weak and anemic. The real common sense answer to how much liquid you put into a braise is you want to make sure that you have a portion of sauce to go along with every portion of meat that you're serving. You know, having the liquid come 1/3 to 1/2 of the way up the size is a great rule of thumb, but choosing an appropriate sized pan is just as important. As this comes up to a simmer, what we want to do is put a lid on it and then let it simmer, and I would say probably for about an hour and a half it'll take for these to get tender. Periodically you want to come in and turn them so that what was in liquid is now out of liquid and vice versa, and continue to cook. And you know it's done when the meat can be pierced easily with a knife and the knife comes out as easily. You may notice that the meat begins to fall from the bone. That's how tender it'll be. If you want to serve it on the bone, you might put a little piece of butcher's twine around there to hold the meat tight to the bone. If you want to pull the meat from the bone, then you don't need to worry about that. So while our lamb shanks are cooking, and as I said, they'll take about an hour and a half to cook in a covered pot, and periodically we'll turn them, I want to move on to make an accompaniment. This is kind of fun. It starts out in a familiar way. I'm going to make a white sauce, and that white sauce begins with flour and butter creating what's known as a roux. And so flour and butter are going to go here in the pan, and let me just stir the two of them together. And what I want to do is cook those two together until the raw flavor of the flour has been mitigated. And there's a couple of different ways to tell, but oftentimes I will take a little piece out and let it cool, or a little spoonful out and let it cool, and then rub it through my thumb and forefingers, and it'll feel a little sandy. Not smooth the way that flour feels, but a little bit sandy. What you don't want to do is color this, because ultimately this is going to be a white sauce. So no color, just cook it. I would say it's going to take maybe a minute. Okay, at this point, I can guarantee you it feels sandy if you were to rub it between your thumb and forefinger. And what I'm going to do next is introduce some liquid. We're going to add some half and half to this. And let me show you what it looks like. First, I add some liquid. And I'll stir that in. Now watch what happens. It begins to thicken almost immediately. As it comes to a boil, it thickens. And what was a roux is now sort of a semi-solid. That's because the starch in that roux has bound the milk that I added. So I'm going to add a second batch of milk, or half and half. And again, we'll stir that until it's smooth and thickened. And I want to carry on in this fashion, using the thickness of this sauce to break up any lumps that might form. Now, at some point, I will reach a special point where it will be sort of semi-solid, semi-liquid, at which point I can introduce the remainder of the liquid and I won't have any lumps. But this idea of incrementally adding liquid is an important idea. Once all the liquid is in, once my white sauce is made, and the French would call this a bechamel, I'm not sure how the Turkish refer to it, but it is a white sauce. Once all the milk is in, then it's pretty typical that you would simmer it for about 15 minutes just to make sure that any raw flavor in the flour is no longer apparent. I think we're at that magic point right now, and you can see it's almost liquid, and we can add just a little bit more, and then we're going to let it simmer. Now, I don't want this to be really thin. This is not a sauce per se. This is going to bind another ingredient. I'm going to bind roasted eggplant with this sauce. Okay, so that can simmer very happily there. And while it does, I'm going to bring this roasted eggplant over. This eggplant has been roasted over an open flame. You can do it under the broiler, you could do it in a hot oven, but what I'm after is this pulp on the inside that's very tender and a little bit smoky from having been fire roasted. And so let me dig it out of the shell and leave all the charred skin behind. It's important that this eggplant should collapse completely. It should not fight back at all. I think we've got just about everything we want. Any flecks of black skin should be taken out. All right, let me set that aside. And the final thing I want to do with this bechamel is I want to add cheese to it. And in the French tradition, when you add cheese to a bechamel, it changes its name and it becomes a Mornay sauce. So I've got some Parmesan here. This is a substitute for a Turkish cheese that's probably pretty difficult to get. But we're going to add that cheese right into the sauce and stir it together. I'm going to add some salt and a little pepper. Some people quarrel with putting black pepper in a white sauce, but for me, I love the flavor of black pepper so much more than white pepper. If it's really a problem, then I would say cayenne pepper is a good substitute. Eggplant puree goes in, and we'll stir these together. And they would offer this up sort of the way you might add mashed potatoes to a dish of braised meat or polenta to a dish of braised meat. This is sort of a starch and a vegetable all mixed into one. And it's done. Now let's have a look and see what's going on with our lamb shanks. If you take a knife and you pierce the meat, if the knife goes in easily and comes out easily, the meat is done. And so I'm going to pull it from the pan. Just like this. And I'll move it right over here. If you look at your sauce, if there's a lot of fat floating on the surface, you can come in here and skim it off. This actually looks pretty good. There is a little bit, but some amount of fat I think is important. It lends richness and flavor both. Some people just blot the surface with a paper towel as a way of getting the fat out. Now, if your sauce is too thin, you can turn up the heat and reduce it, but this actually looks pretty nice. I want to taste it and make sure I'm happy with the flavor. As I said, be careful with salt early on because this is already salty enough. I'm going to add some black pepper because I like this a little spicy. I'm going to add some fresh components to it, and I'm going to put some dill in there, which I like very, very much with lamb. Okay, that smells great. It looks good. I like the consistency. I'm happy with the way this turned out. Let's have a look at the lamb. Now, if you want to present it on the bone, you have to handle it very carefully. And as I said, if you tie a piece of twine around the bone, then it will hold the meat in place. At this point, the bones have done what it is that they need to do, which is to say they've lent their flavor to this delicious sauce. So you can see how easy it is for me to ease the bone away from the meat, just like that. And I'm going to suggest we take the bones out. If there's any pieces of grizzle or fat that you find objectionable, those can be pulled away as well. And what we want at the end of the day is big chunks of perfectly braised lamb. As you run across any little bits and pieces of fat or connective tissue, you can just discard those. So once you're convinced or happy that the meat has been cleaned up, I'm going to say that we should put it back into the sauce just to warm a little bit in big, tender pieces. I've got this one that I'm going to leave on the bone. And this meal is ready to be served. And the eggplant, I'm going to spoon onto the plate. And then we'll bring the lamb over. And the larger piece that's still on the bone, I'll add right here. And some of these smaller pieces can flank the piece in the center. And then finally, just a little bit of chopped parsley. This dish is known as Hunkar Begendi. It references the Sultan swooning, and it is a delicious dish. I don't think it's one you'll soon forget. So I'm going to encourage you to rush out and get some lamb shanks and create this dish so that you can smell exactly what I'm smelling right here and right now. So finally, a simple little Turkish dessert. I have here on the stove some apricots. These are dried apricots. And what I did is I rehydrated, or I plumped them in a little bit of apple juice with sugar, and I added spices. So I see cardamom, cloves, and cinnamon stick, a little bit of orange zest, and I just simmered them briefly and then pulled them off the heat and allowed them to rehydrate, to reabsorb liquid. I did that 2 or 3 times yesterday and then refrigerated them overnight. Today, when I came in, you have these plump little apricots, and what I want to do is stuff them with some drained yogurt. So they're very sweet here, and the drained yogurt is a little bit tart, and the idea is that those two flavors will balance one another. When these apricots were pitted before they were dried, somebody went in here with a knife and they eased the seed out. So my guess is that you'll be able to find a little pocket in each apricot that you buy. If not, you can certainly cut a pocket in, but take a look first, because I think you'll discover that each of them is already open. Get a little bit of the drained yogurt and just ease it into that opening. Give it a mouthful of drained yogurt, if you will. Now, the simplest way of presenting these would be to take and sprinkle on just some chopped pistachios and call it a day. Or if you like the idea, you can take a little bit of the liquid that they poached in and just spoon a little bit over the top so that they glisten. And as you can imagine, they are no longer finger food, but they're easy to take from the tray with a fork and a spoon. So there is a really simple but delicious dessert idea, not unlike things that you might find in Turkey.